Sarah Mitchell adjusted her simple cardigan and smoothed down her knee-length skirt as she stood before the imposing brick facade of Riverside High School. To anyone watching, she looked like every other nervous new teacher on their first day, young, uncertain, perhaps a little too eager to please. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a conservative ponytail, and her wire-rimmed glasses gave her an almost scholarly appearance that screamed easy target to anyone with predatory instincts. What the students streaming past her didn't know was that just 18 months ago, this same woman had been rappelling from helicopters into hostile territory, her hands steady as steel as she neutralized threats that would have broken most people. The transformation from Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, Navy SEAL Team 6, to Miss Mitchell, high school English teacher, was so complete that even she sometimes forgot the warrior that lived beneath the carefully constructed facade. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 6 years of facing down armed insurgents and surviving the most brutal military training known to mankind, her greatest challenge was about to come from a group of entitled teenagers who thought they owned their small corner of Cedar Falls, Ohio. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Cedar Falls carried the crisp promise of autumn as Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors of Riverside High School. Her sensible flats clicked against the polished linoleum floors, a sound that would soon become familiar to the 1,200 students who called this place their academic battleground. The walls were decorated with the typical high school fanfare: championship banners from years past, motivational posters that had seen better days, and student artwork that ranged from genuinely impressive to clearly mandatory participation. Mrs. Patricia Wells, a veteran teacher with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen 3 decades of teenage drama, intercepted Sarah near the main office. Patricia had volunteered to be Sarah's mentor, a gesture that Sarah appreciated more than she could express. In the military, you always had someone watching your six, but in civilian life, especially in a new profession, that kind of backup was rare and precious. Patricia asked with a knowing smile as they walked toward the faculty wing. I remember mine like it was yesterday, though that was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, according to my current students. Sarah managed a laugh that felt only slightly forced. Something like that. I keep telling myself it's just like any other mission briefing, but somehow facing a room full of teenagers feels more unpredictable than anything I encountered in. She caught herself before mentioning her military service. Her cover story was simple and boring: previous teaching experience in San Diego, moved to Ohio for a fresh start after a difficult breakup. Nothing that would raise questions or invite deeper investigation. Trust me, after a few weeks you'll have their number, Patricia continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had successfully managed thousands of young minds over the years. The key is establishing respect early. Some of these kids come from families with money and influence, and they're used to getting their way, but don't let that intimidate you. At the end of the day, they're still children who need structure and guidance. They passed clusters of students gathering around lockers, their conversations creating a constant buzz of teenage energy. Sarah's trained eyes automatically cataloged details: body language, group dynamics, potential threat assessments. It was a habit she couldn't shake, even in this relatively safe environment. She noticed the subtle hierarchies already forming. In the hallways, the way certain students commanded space while others shrank into the background. Her classroom, room 204, was located on the second floor with windows that overlooked the student parking lot. The previous teacher had left behind basic furniture and a few motivational posters about the power of literature, but the space felt sterile and impersonal. Sarah had spent the weekend before school started trying to make it more welcoming, adding plants and arranging the desks in a more collaborative configuration than the traditional rows. Your first period is Advanced Placement Literature, Patricia explained, checking the schedule on her tablet. Technically the school's brightest students, though sometimes intelligence and wisdom don't go hand in hand. You'll have some challenges, but overall, they're good kids. Sarah nodded, remembering her own high school experience, which felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, she had been the quiet student who kept her head down and focused on her studies, never imagining that her future would involve learning 17 different ways to incapacitate an enemy or spending months in hostile environments where a single mistake could mean death. The first bell rang, and students began filtering into her classroom with the particular energy that comes with a new school year. Sarah positioned herself by the door, greeting each student with a warm smile and direct eye contact, a habit from military training where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. Most of the students seemed pleasant enough, offering polite hellos and taking their seats with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies meeting a new teacher. Then Jake Thompson walked in, and Sarah's instincts immediately went on alert. Jake carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences for his actions. At 18, he was tall and athletic with the kind of build that suggested regular gym time and good genetics. His letterman jacket was worn like armor, announcing his status as captain of the football team, and his blonde hair was styled with the kind of casual perfection that took significant time and expensive products to achieve. Behind him came Connor, Davis and Ryan Walsh, his constant companions who moved like satellites around Jake's gravitational pull. Connor was smaller but moved with the quick energy of someone always ready to laugh at his friends' jokes, while Ryan's stockier build and intense stare suggested he was the group's enforcer when situations required more than words. Sarah had seen this dynamic countless times in military units. The alpha personality surrounded by followers who derived their own sense of power from their association with someone they perceived as stronger. The difference was that in the military, that hierarchy served a purpose and was built on actual competence and leadership ability. Here, it seemed based on nothing more than social status and the accident of birth into the right family. Jake's eyes met Sarah's as he entered, and she saw the immediate assessment taking place. He was sizing her up the way predators evaluate potential prey, looking for weakness, uncertainty, anything that could be exploited. Sarah maintained her pleasant teacher expression while mentally cataloging everything about him, from his expensive sneakers to the way he carried his shoulders slightly back in a display of dominance. "Good morning," she said pleasantly as he passed. "Please find a seat anywhere you'd like." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake paused, perhaps expecting more deference or recognition of his obvious status in the school hierarchy. When Sarah simply continued greeting other students, he moved to a desk in the back corner where he could survey the entire room, another power play that Sarah recognized but chose not to engage with directly. The next 20 minutes passed smoothly as Sarah introduced herself and began outlining her expectations for the class. She had spent hours preparing this first-day presentation, knowing that establishing the right tone early would determine how the entire semester unfolded. Her teaching philosophy was straightforward. Respect was earned through consistency and fairness, not through intimidation or arbitrary displays of authority. Literature has the power to help us understand perspectives beyond our own experience. She explained, gesturing to the diverse collection of books she had arranged on her desk. This year, we'll explore works that challenge us to think critically about justice, power, and what it means to be human in complex situations. She noticed Jake whispering something to Connor that made both boys snicker, but decided to let it slide for now. Confronting minor disruptions on the first day could escalate unnecessarily, and she wanted to gather more information about the dynamics at play before taking action. Emily Chun, a petite junior with serious dark eyes, raised her hand tentatively. Miss Mitchell, will we be discussing contemporary issues through literature, or focusing more on classical analysis? Sarah smiled, appreciating the thoughtful question. Both, actually. We'll examine how timeless themes in classical literature connect to modern challenges. For example, we might look at how Shakespeare's exploration of power and corruption in Macbeth relates to contemporary examples of leadership failures. Sounds boring, Jake muttered. Just loud enough for several students to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah's military training had taught her to pick her battles carefully. This wasn't worth a direct confrontation yet, but she filed the information away for future reference. Jake Thompson was clearly used to being the center of attention and wasn't pleased that her classroom didn't revolve around acknowledging his importance. The rest of the period proceeded without major incidents, though Sarah noticed Jake continuing to make small disruptions, tapping his pen loudly during quiet moments, having whispered conversations with his friends, and generally testing the boundaries to see how she would respond. It was classic probing behavior, the kind she had observed in hostile environments where adversaries tested defenses before committing to larger attacks. As students filed out for their next class, Emily Chun lingered behind, approaching Sarah's desk with obvious nervousness. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure Jake and his friends were gone. "I just wanted to say thank you for making the class about learning instead of other things." Sarah looked up from her lesson plan, sensing there was more to this conversation than simple appreciation. Other things? Emily hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to say more. Some teachers here, they kind of let certain students get away with stuff because of who their families are. It gets old, you know? When you're actually trying to learn, but you have to listen to disruptions and jokes all the time. The picture was becoming clearer. Jake's behavior wasn't just teenage testing of authority. It was part of an established pattern where his family's influence in the community had created a culture of special treatment. Sarah had encountered similar dynamics in various military and civilian contexts, where wealth and connections created alternative rule structures that undermined official authority. "I appreciate you telling me that, Emily," Sarah said carefully. "I believe every student deserves a classroom environment where they can focus on learning. That's going to be my priority this year." Emily smiled with what looked like relief. "Good. And Miss Mitchell? If you need anything, or if you want to know about how things really work around here, Maria in custodial services sees everything. She's been here longer than anyone and actually cares about the students." After Emily left, Sarah sat alone in her classroom, processing the morning's information. In military intelligence, you learn to read between the lines and pay attention to what people didn't say as much as what they did. Emily's warning suggested that Jake Thompson's behavior was part of a larger systemic issue at Riverside High School, one that previous teachers had either been unable or unwilling to address effectively. Sarah's second period was freshman English, a welcome change of pace from the political dynamics of her AP class. The younger students were eager and nervous, still adjusting to high school expectations and genuinely excited about learning. She found herself relaxing into the teaching role, remembering why she had chosen this profession after leaving the military. During her lunch break, she decided to take Emily's advice and seek out Maria Rodriguez. She found the custodial supervisor restocking supplies in a storage closet near the gymnasium, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "You're the new English teacher," Maria said before Sarah could introduce herself. "Word travels fast. Around here, how was your first morning?" "Interesting," Sarah replied diplomatically. "I'm still learning the lay of the land." Maria paused in her inventory work and studied Sarah with the kind of direct assessment that comes from years of observing human behavior. "Let me guess. Jake Thompson and his crew decided to test the new teacher's boundaries?" Sarah was impressed by the accuracy of the observation. Is it that obvious? Honey, I've been watching that boy and his friends for 4 years now. They think this school exists for their entertainment, and too many adults have enabled that belief. Maria's voice carried a mixture of frustration and resignation. His daddy owns half the car lots in town and contributes heavily to the school board campaigns. The family's been throwing their weight around here since before Jake was born. What about the other teachers? How do they handle it? Maria sighed, setting down her clipboard. Most of them have learned to pick their battles carefully. The ones who pushed back too hard tend to find themselves dealing with parent complaints, administrative pressure, and sometimes even job security issues. The Thompson family doesn't like being told no. Sarah felt a familiar stirring of the protective instincts that had driven her to military service in the first place. She had spent years defending people who couldn't defend themselves, and the idea that a group of entitled teenagers was terrorizing a school community while adults looked the other way triggered every warrior instinct she possessed. What about the students? How do they cope with it? The smart ones like Emily keep their heads down and try to stay invisible. The unlucky ones who catch Jake's attention for any reason usually end up transferring schools or just enduring. Until graduation, Maria's expression darkened. Last year, he and his friends made a sophomore girl's life so miserable that she ended up in therapy. Her parents complained, but somehow it all got swept under the rug. Sarah felt her jaw clench involuntarily, a reaction that would have been familiar to anyone who had served alongside her in combat zones. The idea of predators targeting vulnerable people while authority figures enabled their behavior struck at the core of everything she believed in. "I appreciate you being straight with me," Sarah said. "I believe every student deserves to feel safe at school." Maria nodded approvingly. "I like you already. Just be careful how you handle things. Jake's not just some random bully. He's smart. His family has resources, and he's got 3.5 years of experience manipulating this system. Don't underestimate what he's capable of." The afternoon brought Sarah's final class of the day, regular junior English, which included a mix of students from different social circles. Jake wasn't in this class, but Connor Davis was, along with several students who seemed to orbit the popular crowd without being full members. The period started smoothly enough, with Sarah guiding the class through an introduction to their first unit on character development in literature. She noticed Connor whispering to a few other students, but nothing that rose to the level of disruption. Then, about halfway through the class, Connor raised his hand with an expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. Her military training had taught her to recognize when someone was preparing to probe for weakness or create a distraction. "Miss Mitchell," Connor said with exaggerated politeness, "I was wondering about your teaching experience. Where did you work before coming to Riverside?" Sarah recognized the question for what it was, not genuine curiosity about her qualifications, but an attempt to gather information that could be used against her later. In intelligence work, this was called reconnaissance, and the fact that a 17-year-old was employing the tactic suggested that Jake's crew was more sophisticated than typical high school bullies. "I taught in San Diego," Sarah replied calmly, sticking to her cover story. "Different environment, but literature and human nature are pretty universal." "San Diego's expensive," Connor continued, his tone suggesting casual conversation while his eyes watched her carefully for reactions. "Big change coming to a small town like Cedar Falls. Must have been quite a story behind that decision." Several other students were now paying attention to the exchange, sensing some kind of undercurrent. They didn't fully understand. Sarah realized that Connor was essentially conducting an interrogation disguised as friendly interest, probably gathering ammunition for Jake's use. "Sometimes people just want a change of pace," Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now let's get back to our discussion of character motivation." Can anyone give me an example of a literary character whose actions were driven by something other than what they initially claimed? Connor looked slightly frustrated that his fishing expedition hadn't yielded more information, but he dropped the line of questioning. Sarah made a mental note that Jake's group was already conducting intelligence-gathering operations against her, which suggested they viewed her as a potential threat to their established order. The rest of the class period passed without incident, but Sarah found herself thinking about the dynamics she was uncovering. In military terms, she was operating in hostile territory where the enemy had superior knowledge of the terrain and established supply lines. Jake Thompson and his crew had 4 years of experience working this system, family resources to draw upon, and apparent administrative protection. What they didn't know was that they were now facing someone whose entire adult life had been spent in environments where the stakes were infinitely higher than high school social dynamics. Sarah had learned to survive and thrive in situations where enemies had every advantage except her training, determination, and refusal to back down from a just fight. As students filed out at the end of the day, Sarah began planning her strategy. She wouldn't go looking for confrontation, but she wouldn't back down when Jake and his friends inevitably escalated their testing behavior. In the meantime, she would continue gathering intelligence, building relationships with allies like Emily and Maria, and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. The quiet new English teacher was about to become something none of them expected, but that transformation would come in response to their actions, not as an unprovoked attack. Sarah Mitchell had learned patience in the military, along with the wisdom to let enemies reveal their weaknesses before striking. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah suspected that Jake Thompson was just getting started with his campaign to establish dominance over the newest member of Riverside High School's faculty. What he didn't realize was that he was about to test someone whose definition of unacceptable behavior had been forged in life and death situations, where failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. The game was beginning, and only one side knew the real rules. The second week at Riverside High School brought with it the kind of subtle warfare that Sarah recognized from her military experience. Jake Thompson wasn't launching direct attacks yet, but he was probing her defenses with the methodical precision of someone who understood psychological operations better than most teenagers should. It started with small disruptions during her advanced placement literature class. Jake would arrive exactly 30 seconds after the bell, making just enough noise with his chair and backpack to interrupt whatever Sarah was saying. He'd apologize with exaggerated politeness that fooled no one, then settle into his seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully commanded attention. Sarah responded by continuing her lesson without acknowledging the disruption, a technique she had learned in dealing with hostile interrogators, who used similar tactics to break concentration and establish dominance. The key was never to let them see that their actions were having the desired effect, even when your blood pressure was rising and every instinct screamed for immediate retaliation. Connor Davis had taken on the role of Jake's intelligence officer, asking seemingly innocent questions designed to gather information about Sarah's background, teaching philosophy, and potential vulnerabilities. During a discussion of The Great Gatsby, he raised his hand with a perfectly reasonable expression. "Miss Mitchell, when you were teaching in San Diego, did you ever have students from military families? I mean, with all the bases out there. It must have been different from here in Ohio." Sarah recognized the fishing expedition immediately. Connor was trying to determine if she had any military connections that might explain her composure under pressure. In the intelligence community, this was called social engineering, and the fact that a 17-year-old was employing it with such sophistication suggested that Jake's crew had learned these tactics from somewhere. Every community has its unique characteristics, Sarah replied evenly. But literature speaks to universal human experiences, regardless of background. She smoothly redirected the conversation back to symbolism in Fitzgerald's work, but she noticed Jake watching her carefully during the exchange. He was learning her patterns, testing her responses, and building a psychological profile that he could exploit later. Ryan Walsh, the third member of their group, preferred more direct methods of intimidation. He had a habit of lingering after class, ostensibly to ask questions about assignments, but actually to invade her personal space and see how she reacted to physical proximity from someone who radiated barely controlled aggression. "Miss Mitchell," he said one afternoon, standing closer to her desk than necessary while she graded papers, "I'm having trouble understanding the symbolism assignment. Could you explain it again?" Sarah looked up calmly, her military training automatically cataloging his stance, hand positions, and escape routes. Ryan was trying to use his size and presence to make her uncomfortable, probably expecting her to back away or show signs of nervousness that would signal vulnerability. Instead, she maintained steady eye contact and spoke in the same professional tone she would use with any student. "The assignment sheet has detailed instructions. Ryan, if you have specific questions about particular symbols, I'd be happy to address those during office hours when I can give you my full attention." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly at her refusal to be intimidated, but he couldn't push further without crossing lines that would give her grounds for administrative action. He mumbled something about maybe coming back later and left with the frustrated energy of someone whose intimidation tactics had failed to produce the desired results. Sarah understood that these were preliminary skirmishes designed to test her responses and identify weaknesses that could be exploited in larger confrontations. Jake and his friends were conducting what military strategists called shaping operations, preparing the battlefield for a more significant engagement that would establish dominance once and for all. The real escalation began during her 4th week at Riverside High School. Sarah had been building relationships with other faculty members, learning more about the school's unspoken power dynamics, and documenting patterns of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of institutional dysfunction. Mrs. Wells had confided that 3 teachers had requested transfers out of Riverside in the past 2 years, all citing philosophical differences with the administration. When pressed for details, Patricia had explained that challenging certain students often resulted in parent complaints that somehow reached the school board level with suspicious speed and coordination. "The Thompson family has been influential in this community for decades," Patricia explained during lunch in the faculty room. "Jake's grandfather was mayor for 12 years. His father owns multiple businesses and sponsors half the athletic programs. When they make their displeasure known, people listen." Sarah absorbed this information while maintaining her cover as a naive new teacher still learning the ropes. In reality, she was conducting the kind of environmental assessment that had kept her alive in hostile territories where local power structures could determine mission success or failure. The first major confrontation came on a Thursday morning when Sarah discovered Emily Chun crying quietly in her classroom before first period. The young woman's usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the stress she had been hiding behind academic focus and careful invisibility. "Emily, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, closing the classroom door to provide privacy. "It's nothing, Miss Mitchell. I just had a bad morning." Sarah's training in reading human behavior made it immediately clear that Emily was lying to protect herself or someone else. The girl's body language screamed distress, and there were subtle signs of recent emotional trauma that Sarah recognized from her experience working with civilians in war zones. "Emily, I can see that something significant has upset you. You don't have to tell me what happened, but I want you to know that this classroom is a safe space where students don't have to face problems alone." Emily's composure finally broke, and the story came pouring out between tears and angry frustration. Jake and his friends had cornered her in the parking lot before school, ostensibly to ask about homework for a class they shared. But the real purpose had been intimidation disguised as social interaction. "Jake kept asking me about you," Emily explained, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "He wanted to know what you and I talked about, whether you'd said anything about him or his friends. When I told him we just discussed literature, he got this look on his face like he didn't believe me." Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that came with discovering that predators were targeting vulnerable people under her protection. In military terms, Emily was a civilian asset who had provided valuable intelligence, and Jake's harassment represented an escalation that required immediate response. Then Connor started making jokes about how I probably had a crush on you or something. And Ryan said maybe they should tell their parents that you were playing favorites with certain students. They kept laughing like it was all just fun, but their eyes were serious. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Jake's crew was using intimidation tactics against Emily to gather intelligence about Sarah while simultaneously threatening to weaponize false accusations against her professionally. It was a sophisticated operation that demonstrated both strategic thinking and complete moral bankruptcy. "Emily, I want you to know that you did nothing wrong by talking to me, and you're not responsible for how others choose to behave," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from extensive leadership experience. No student should have to worry about being harassed for asking academic questions or participating in class discussions. "But Miss Mitchell, you don't understand how things work here. The Thompson family can make trouble for teachers who cross them. I don't want you to get in problems because of me." Sarah recognized the fear in Emily's voice as the same emotion she had encountered in civilians living under the control of local strongmen in various global hotspots. The dynamic was identical, just scaled down to a high school environment instead of a war zone. "Emily, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but protecting students is part of my job description. No one should have to navigate their education while being intimidated by bullies, regardless of who their families are." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other students for first period. But Sarah had heard enough to understand that Jake Thompson had just escalated from testing boundaries to actively threatening her allies. In military terms, he had transitioned from reconnaissance to offensive operations, which meant the rules of engagement were about to change dramatically. Jake arrived precisely on time for class that morning, his usual confident demeanor intact but with an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested he was expecting some kind of reaction from Sarah regarding his parking lot encounter with Emily. He took his seat in the back corner and watched her with the focused attention of someone waiting for a show to begin. Sarah conducted the class exactly as she had every other day, discussing the assigned reading with professional competence while giving no indication that anything had changed. But internally, she was shifting into combat mode, preparing for the kind of sustained operation that required patience, strategic thinking, and absolute commitment to mission success. Jake's expression shifted from anticipation to confusion as the period progressed without any acknowledgement of his psychological operation against Emily. He had expected either confrontation or capitulation, but Sarah's apparent indifference to his intimidation tactics clearly wasn't part of his planned scenarios. During lunch, Sarah made a decision that would have been familiar to anyone who had served with her in the military. She was going to take the initiative rather than continue operating in purely defensive mode. But her approach would be methodical and legally bulletproof, giving Jake and his friends enough rope to hang themselves while building an unassailable case for administrative action. Her first step was documenting everything. Sarah began keeping detailed records of every disruption, every inappropriate comment, and every instance of intimidation she witnessed or learned about. She noted dates, times, witnesses, and specific behaviors with the precision of someone preparing intelligence reports for command review. She also began building a network of allies among the faculty and staff. Maria Rodriguez became an invaluable source of information about student behavior outside the classroom, while Patricia Wells provided historical context about previous incidents that had been swept under the administrative rug. "The pattern is always the same," Patricia explained during a private conversation in Sarah's classroom after school. "Jake and his friends push boundaries until someone pushes back. Then their families claim the teacher is being unfair or targeting their children. The administration usually chooses the path of least resistance, which means the teacher either learns to look the other way or finds themselves encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the institutional capture that occurred when wealthy and influential families were allowed to operate outside normal disciplinary structures. She had seen similar dynamics in various international contexts, where local power brokers corrupted official systems to serve their personal interests. What about documentation? Has anyone ever tried to build a comprehensive case with evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored? Patricia's expression turned rueful. Most teachers are too busy trying to survive their daily responsibilities to conduct that kind of detailed investigation. And honestly, most of us didn't have the training or experience to know how to build an airtight case that could withstand the kind of legal and political pressure the Thompson family can bring to bear. Sarah smiled grimly. Patricia was absolutely right that most teachers lacked the specialized skills needed for this kind of operation. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't most teachers, and her background in military intelligence had provided her with exactly the training needed to conduct systematic documentation of hostile activities while building networks of reliable informants. The escalation she was expecting came the following Monday morning. Jake arrived at her classroom 15 minutes before first period, accompanied by Connor and Ryan, all three wearing expressions of barely contained aggression that immediately put Sarah on high alert. "Miss Mitchell," Jake said with exaggerated politeness that didn't match his body language, "we wanted to talk to you about some concerns we've been hearing from other students." Sarah looked up from her lesson planning, her expression professionally neutral while her tactical awareness shifted into overdrive. 3 potentially hostile individuals had entered her domain with obvious aggressive intent, positioning themselves to control her exit routes while maintaining plausible deniability about their true purpose. "I'm happy to discuss any legitimate academic concerns during office hours," she replied calmly. "Right now I need to prepare for class." "This won't take long," Connor interjected, his tone carrying an undercurrent of threat. "Some people are saying you've been showing favoritism to certain students and maybe asking inappropriate questions about personal matters." Sarah recognized this as a classic intimidation tactic, using vague accusations that couldn't be specifically refuted while creating an atmosphere of threat and uncertainty. In intelligence work, this was called psychological warfare, designed to make targets feel isolated and vulnerable. "If anyone has specific concerns about my professional conduct, they're welcome to discuss them with the administration through proper channels," Sarah said, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism while her peripheral vision tracked all 3 students' positions and movements. Ryan stepped closer to her desk, his posture radiating barely controlled aggression. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. When students have concerns, they usually get addressed quickly and quietly, without involving a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy." The threat was now explicit enough that Sarah could respond accordingly. In military terms, Jake's crew had just transitioned from psychological operations to direct intimidation, which gave her legal and professional justification for escalating her own response. "I understand perfectly how things should work in a professional educational environment," Sarah replied, standing up slowly to eliminate the psychological advantage of height differential. "Students who have legitimate concerns follow established procedures. Students who attempt to intimidate faculty members face disciplinary consequences." Jake's eyes narrowed at her refusal to be cowed by their implicit threats. "You know, Miss Mitchell, teaching can be a really rewarding profession for people who understand how to work cooperatively with the community. But sometimes teachers who try to change too much too fast find that the job isn't what they expected. Sarah felt the familiar surge of controlled fury that came when enemies revealed their true nature through explicit threats. Jake Thompson had just crossed from teenager testing boundaries to adult-level intimidation tactics, which meant she was now dealing with a genuinely dangerous individual rather than just an immature bully. "Thank you for sharing your perspective on educational cooperation," she said with a smile that anyone familiar with her military background would have recognized as extremely dangerous. "I'll be sure to keep your thoughts in mind as I continue, focusing on providing the best possible learning environment for all of my students." The three young men exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that their intimidation attempt had failed, but uncertain about how to escalate further without crossing lines that would bring immediate administrative consequences. They had expected either fear or angry confrontation, both of which would have served their purposes. Sarah's calm professionalism was clearly not part of their planned scenarios. "We'll be keeping an eye on how things develop," Jake said finally, his tone carrying a promise of future action. "I'm sure you will," Sarah replied pleasantly. "Now, unless you have specific questions about today's literature assignment, I need to finish my preparation for class." After they left, Sarah sat quietly for several minutes, processing what had just occurred while her heart rate returned to normal. Jake Thompson and his friends had just declared war on her authority, using tactics sophisticated enough to suggest either extensive experience or coaching from adults who understood psychological manipulation. But they had also made a critical error in judgment. By escalating to direct threats, they had revealed themselves as genuine predators rather than mere teenage troublemakers, which meant Sarah was now justified in responding with the full range of her professional and personal capabilities. The quiet new English teacher was about to become something none of them had anticipated, but that transformation would be entirely their own doing. Sarah Mitchell had spent years learning how to neutralize threats while operating within legal and ethical constraints, and Jake Thompson was about to discover what happened when institutional bullies encountered someone whose definition of acceptable behavior had been forged in environments where the stakes were measured in lives rather than social status. The game was escalating exactly as Sarah had predicted, and she was more than ready for whatever came next. The atmosphere at Riverside High School shifted perceptibly in the days following Jake's direct confrontation with Sarah. Word had spread through the student body with the lightning speed that characterizes teenage communication networks, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. Some versions painted Jake as defending student rights against an overly strict teacher, while others suggested that the new English instructor had somehow managed to stand her ground against the school's most influential student. Sarah noticed the change immediately. Students who had previously ignored her now watched her movements through the hallways with curious interest. Some seemed hopeful, as if witnessing an adult who might actually challenge the established power structure. Others appeared nervous, perhaps anticipating the kind of administrative backlash that had historically followed any serious challenge to the Thompson family's influence. Emily Chun approached Sarah's desk after class on Wednesday with the hesitant manner of someone delivering intelligence that might be valuable, but was definitely dangerous to possess. "Miss Mitchell," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "I thought you should know that Jake's been asking questions around school. Not just about you, but about your background, where you came from, what kind of references you provided when you got hired." Sarah felt a familiar chill of recognition. Jake Thompson was conducting opposition research with the methodical approach of someone who understood that information warfare could be more effective than direct confrontation. In military intelligence, this was called target development, and it suggested that Jake was planning something significantly more sophisticated than teenage pranks. "What kind of questions specifically?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining casual while her analytical mind began processing threat assessments. He's been talking to other teachers, asking them what they know about your previous job in San Diego. He also had Connor approach some of the office staff, pretending to be interested in the student-teacher program and asking about the hiring process, what kind of background checks they do, that sort of thing. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the intelligence-gathering operation for what it was. Jake wasn't just trying to intimidate her anymore. He was building a case for discrediting her professionally. This represented a significant escalation. That suggested either sophisticated strategic thinking or adult guidance from someone who understood how to weaponize institutional processes. Emily, I appreciate you keeping me informed. Has Jake or anyone in his group made any specific threats or inappropriate requests for information? Not exactly threats, Emily replied carefully, but yesterday Ryan asked me if I knew whether you were married or had a boyfriend. When I said I didn't know anything about your personal life, he made some comment about how single women teachers sometimes get lonely and develop inappropriate relationships with students. Sarah felt her jaw clench involuntarily. Ryan Walsh was laying groundwork for character assassination through sexual innuendo, a tactic she had seen used against female personnel in military contexts where enemies couldn't attack professional competence directly. It was particularly insidious because defending against such accusations often gave them more credibility than ignoring them. That's completely inappropriate, Sarah said firmly, and I want you to know that if anyone asks you to participate in spreading rumors or making false statements, you have every right to refuse and report the request to the administration. Emily nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Miss Mitchell, there's something else. Jake's older brother Derek has been hanging around the school parking lot after hours. Maria in custodial mentioned seeing him talking to some of the seniors, and she thought you should know. This information sent immediate alarm signals through Sarah's threat assessment matrix. Derek Thompson was 22 years old, no longer a student, and had no legitimate reason to be conducting business on school property. His presence suggested that Jake's campaign against her was receiving adult support, which dramatically changed the risk profile of the situation. In military terms, Jake had just called in reinforcements from outside the immediate area of operations. Derek represented an escalation to adult-level harassment that could potentially include stalking behaviors, property damage, or direct physical threats. Sarah's cover as a mild-mannered English teacher was about to be tested by someone who wouldn't be constrained by the school's disciplinary procedures. Thank you for that information, Emily. I want you to be very careful about your own safety. If Derek or anyone else approaches you with questions or requests, find a trusted adult immediately, and don't engage with them directly. After Emily left, Sarah spent several minutes conducting a tactical assessment of her current situation. Jake Thompson had successfully escalated from teenage boundary testing to adult-level psychological warfare, complete with intelligence gathering, character assassination attempts, and outside reinforcements. The scope and sophistication of the operation suggested that the Thompson family viewed her as a genuine threat to their control over Riverside High School's social and disciplinary ecosystem. Sarah's military background provided her with extensive experience in exactly this type of asymmetric conflict, where enemies with superior local resources and institutional connections attempted to neutralize threats through indirect methods rather than open confrontation. The key to success in such situations was patience, documentation, and careful preparation for the inevitable moment when enemies overplayed their hand and provided justification for decisive response. Her first priority was hardening her personal security while maintaining her cover as an ordinary teacher. Sarah began varying her routes to and from school, parking in different locations, and maintaining heightened awareness of her surroundings. She also started documenting Derek Thompson's presence on school property, including dates, times, and any interactions she observed. The next escalation came on Friday afternoon as Sarah was leaving the building after staying late to grade papers. She noticed a familiar figure leaning against a pickup truck in the faculty parking lot, positioned to intercept her route to her vehicle. Derek Thompson was larger and more muscular than his younger brother, with the kind of build that suggested regular physical labor combined with weight training. His posture radiated the casual aggression of someone accustomed to using physical intimidation to achieve objectives. Sarah's tactical training immediately kicked in as she assessed the situation. Single adult male in an isolated location, positioned to control her movement, no witnesses in immediate vicinity, and unclear intentions that could range from verbal harassment to physical assault. Her cover identity required her to appear like a typical teacher who might be frightened or intimidated by such a confrontation, but her actual capabilities were more than sufficient to handle whatever Derek Thompson might attempt. "You're Miss Mitchell, right?" Derek called out as she approached, his tone carrying the false friendliness that predators often use to disarm potential victims. "I'm Derek Thompson, Jake's older brother. I was hoping we could have a quick conversation." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor while subtly adjusting her stance to improve her defensive options. "I'm sorry, but I don't discuss student matters with family members outside of official conferences scheduled through the administration." Derek pushed himself away from his truck and took a step closer, using his size advantage in an obvious attempt at intimidation. "See, that's part of the problem. My little brother seems to think you've got some kind of issue with him, and that's creating problems for our whole family. Jake is welcome to discuss any academic concerns through appropriate channels," Sarah replied calmly, her peripheral vision tracking Derek's movements while identifying potential weapons and escape routes. "I treat all students fairly and professionally." "That's not what I'm hearing," Derek continued, moving to position himself between Sarah and her car. "Word is you've been targeting Jake and his friends, maybe because you've got some kind of agenda against successful families in this community." Sarah recognized the confrontation for what it was. Derek was attempting to establish dominance through physical intimidation, while creating a narrative that painted the Thompson family as victims of her supposed prejudice. It was a sophisticated psychological operation designed to justify whatever escalation might follow. "I'm not sure who's providing you with information about classroom interactions," Sarah said, her voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flow through her system. "But I'd suggest you discuss any concerns with the school administration rather than approaching faculty members in parking lots." Derek's expression hardened at her refusal to be intimidated. "Listen, lady, I don't think you understand the situation here. The Thompson family has deep roots in this community, and we don't appreciate outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble for no good reason." The threat was now explicit enough that Sarah could respond accordingly, but she chose to maintain her cover for a few more seconds to see how far Derek was willing to escalate. In military terms, she was allowing the enemy to reveal the full scope of their intentions before engaging. "Mr. Thompson, this conversation is inappropriate and I'm going to end it now. If you continue to block my access to my vehicle, I'll be forced to contact security." Derek laughed harshly. "Security? Lady, you're in Cedar Falls now, not whatever big city you came from. Things work differently here, and the sooner you learn that, the easier your life is going to be." He took another step forward, now close, enough that Sarah could smell cigarettes and beer on his breath. Derek Thompson was either drunk or had been drinking, which made him significantly more unpredictable and dangerous than she had initially assessed. "Last chance to have a reasonable conversation," Derek said, his voice dropping to a more menacing tone. "My family doesn't like having problems with teachers, but we're not going to let some outsider think she can come in here and disrespect us without consequences." Sarah realized that Derek was preparing to escalate to physical contact, probably planning to grab her arm or shoulder in a gesture designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. It was exactly the kind of boundary-testing behavior that predators use to gauge victim responses before committing to more serious assault. "Mr. Thompson, you need to step back and allow me to leave immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that Derek probably attributed to growing fear, but actually represented her transition from civilian teacher to military operator. Instead of complying, Derek reached out toward her shoulder with the confident motion of someone accustomed to using physical intimidation without serious resistance. What happened next would have been difficult for an untrained observer to follow, but the results were unmistakable. Sarah intercepted Derek's reaching hand with a precise defensive movement, redirected his momentum using his own forward motion, and applied a joint lock that immediately dropped him to one knee beside her car. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and left Derek Thompson gasping in pain while Sarah maintained control of his wrist with minimal apparent effort. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said calmly, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command authority, "you attempted to grab me without permission after making verbal threats. That constitutes assault under Ohio state law, and I would be justified in calling the police to have you arrested." Derek's eyes were wide with shock and pain as he struggled to process what had just happened. The mild-mannered English teacher had just neutralized his physical advantage with techniques that suggested extensive training in close-quarters combat. "However," Sarah continued, maintaining the joint lock while speaking in conversational tones, "I'm willing to consider this a case of poor judgment influenced by alcohol rather than criminal intent, provided you agree to certain conditions." Derek nodded frantically, his previous confidence replaced by genuine fear as he realized he was completely helpless in her grip. "First, you will never approach me or any other faculty member in a threatening manner again. Second, you will stay off school property unless you have legitimate business that's been approved by the administration. Third, you will encourage your brother to resolve any academic concerns through proper channels rather than attempting intimidation or harassment." Sarah released the joint lock and stepped back, watching as Derek struggled to his feet while flexing his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. "Do we have an understanding, Mr. Thompson?" Derek nodded silently, his earlier bravado completely deflated by the demonstration that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Excellent. I suggest you use this experience as an opportunity to reconsider how you approach problem solving in the future." Sarah walked calmly to her car and drove away, leaving Derek Thompson standing alone in the parking lot, probably trying to figure out how to explain to his family that the quiet new teacher had just handled him like a child throwing a tantrum. Word of Derek's encounter with Sarah spread through certain circles over the weekend, though the details were probably embellished beyond recognition by the time they reached Jake and his friends. Sarah suspected that Derek's version of events would paint her as either lucky or deceptive about her background, but the fact remained that the Thompson family's attempt at adult-level intimidation had backfired spectacularly. Monday morning brought a noticeable shift in Jake's behavior during first-period advanced placement literature. He arrived on time, took his seat without disruption, and participated in class discussion with something approaching normal student behavior. Sarah recognized this as either genuine recalibration based on new information about her capabilities, or tactical regrouping before attempting a different approach. Connor and Ryan were more obviously affected by whatever version of Derek's story they had heard. Connor kept stealing glances at Sarah throughout the class period, as if trying to reconcile her mild appearance with whatever his friend's brother had told them. Ryan maintained his usual aggressive posture, but seemed less confident about testing boundaries through physical intimidation. After class, Jake lingered behind as other students filed out, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone lacking the calculated disrespect that had characterized their previous interactions. I wanted to apologize if my brother caused any problems for you last week. Sometimes Derek gets carried away when he thinks family honor is involved. Sarah studied Jake's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. His body language suggested genuine concern, but Jake Thompson had already demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation tactics. I appreciate your concern. Jake, your brother and I were able to resolve our misunderstanding through direct communication. Jake nodded slowly, clearly processing information that went well. Beyond whatever sanitized version Derek had provided to the family. Miss Mitchell, can I ask you something personal? Sarah waited, curious about what direction this conversation might take. What kind of teacher were you in San Diego? I mean, did you work with difficult students, or dangerous schools, or anything like that? The question suggested that Jake was beginning to suspect that her background included elements not covered by her official resume. Sarah chose her response carefully, wanting to provide enough information to deter future escalation without revealing details that could compromise her cover. Every school has its challenges, Jake. Some of my previous experience involved working with students who were dealing with difficult circumstances outside the classroom. It taught me that most behavioral problems stem from underlying issues rather than genuine malice. Jake absorbed this information with the focused attention of someone receiving intelligence about a previously misunderstood adversary. So you're not just some random teacher who doesn't understand how things work in the real world. I'd like to think I have some perspective on conflict resolution and establishing mutual respect. Sarah replied diplomatically. Jake was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing his options based on this new understanding of who he was dealing with. Miss Mitchell, hypothetically speaking, if someone had been making mistakes in how they approached problems, and they wanted to find better ways to handle things, would you be willing to help them figure out different approaches? Sarah recognized this as a potential surrender overture, Jake's way of testing whether she would be receptive to de-escalation rather than continuing the conflict that his family was clearly losing. Jake, I believe that intelligent people can usually find solutions to problems when they're willing to communicate honestly and treat each other with respect. My door is always open for students who want to discuss better approaches to achieving their goals. Jake nodded thoughtfully, then surprised Sarah with a question that suggested genuine self-reflection. What would you do if you were 18 years old and realized that everything your family had taught you about leadership and problem-solving was actually just bullying with better PR? The question revealed more about Jake's internal struggle than he probably intended. Sarah realized that Derek's failed intimidation attempt had forced Jake to confront the possibility that his family's approach to conflict resolution was not only morally questionable, but also practically ineffective against people who possessed real strength rather than mere social positioning. That would be a difficult realization for anyone, Sarah said carefully. But recognizing the problem is usually the first step toward finding better solutions. Real leadership involves inspiring people to follow you because they believe in your vision and trust your judgment, not because they're afraid of the consequences of disagreeing with you. Jake absorbed this perspective with obvious interest, suggesting that he was genuinely considering alternatives to the Thompson family's traditional approach to social dominance. Miss Mitchell, would it be possible for me to start over with you? I mean, pretend like the first month never happened, and try to be the kind of student you'd actually want to teach. Sarah felt a surge of cautious optimism. Jake Thompson's request for a clean slate suggested that the Thompson family's escalation strategy had inadvertently created an opportunity for genuine positive change rather than just continued conflict. Jake, I think everyone deserves the chance to grow beyond their mistakes. If you're serious about changing how you approach things, I'm willing to work with you on that. For the first time since she had arrived at Riverside High School, Jake Thompson smiled at her with what appeared to be genuine respect rather than calculated manipulation. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell. I think I've got a lot to learn about being a better leader than what my family taught me." Jake Thompson's apparent transformation created a ripple effect throughout Riverside High School that Sarah observed with the analytical detachment of someone trained to assess rapidly changing tactical situations. While her military experience had taught her to remain skeptical of sudden behavioral changes in hostile actors, she also recognized genuine remorse when she encountered it. Over the following weeks, Jake's conduct in her advanced placement literature class underwent a dramatic shift. He arrived punctually, participated thoughtfully in discussions, and treated both Sarah and his classmates with newfound respect. More importantly, he began using his social influence to discourage disruptive behavior from other students, rather than encouraging it. Connor Davis and Ryan Walsh initially seemed confused by their leader's change in approach. Sarah watched them struggle to adapt to Jake's new dynamic, their previous roles as enforcers and provocateurs suddenly obsolete. Connor appeared relieved by the reduction in conflict, but Ryan's aggressive tendencies seemed to intensify without Jake's leadership to provide direction and boundaries. The real test of Jake's commitment came during a class discussion of Lord of the Flies, when the conversation naturally evolved toward themes of leadership, power, and moral responsibility. Sarah had chosen the novel deliberately, recognizing its potential to illuminate the dynamics that had been playing out in her classroom and the broader school environment. "The interesting thing about Jack Meridew," Jake said during their analysis of Golding's antagonist, "is that he's not evil in the traditional sense. He's just using the leadership methods that probably worked for him in his previous environment, but they're completely destructive in the new situation." Sarah felt a flutter of hope at Jake's insight. His analysis suggested genuine understanding of how leadership styles could become toxic when applied inappropriately, which might indicate real personal growth rather than mere tactical adaptation. "That's an excellent observation. Jake, can you elaborate on what you think made Jack's approach so destructive to the group dynamic?" Jake considered the question carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than performative. "I think Jack confused fear with respect. He could make people follow him by threatening consequences, but that doesn't actually inspire anyone to do their best work or contribute to group success. It just makes people focus on avoiding punishment instead of pursuing excellence." Several other students nodded in recognition, and Sarah realized that Jake's commentary was resonating with classmates who had experienced his previous leadership style firsthand. His willingness to engage in public self-criticism was creating space for others to examine their own relationships with power and influence. Emily Chun raised her hand tentatively, the fragile peace that had settled over Sarah's classroom following Jake's apparent transformation lasted exactly 3 weeks before the Thompson family's broader influence reasserted itself in ways that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The first warning sign came during a faculty meeting on a gray October afternoon when Principal Hayes announced new community engagement initiatives that would bring local business leaders into closer collaboration with the educational process. Sarah listened with growing unease as Hayes outlined partnerships that would give prominent families greater input into curriculum decisions and disciplinary policies. The language was carefully diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. The school administration was doubling down on their accommodation of local power structures rather than challenging the systemic problems that enabled student harassment and teacher intimidation. Mrs. Wells caught Sarah's eye across the conference room, her expression conveying the same concern that Sarah felt. After the meeting, Patricia lingered in the hallway until other faculty members had dispersed before approaching Sarah with obvious urgency. "This is about you," Patricia said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Robert Thompson called an emergency school board meeting last week, claiming that recent incidents involving faculty members had created a crisis of confidence in the school's leadership. Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognition that came with discovering enemy countermoves she hadn't fully anticipated. Robert Thompson, Jake's father, was using his son's temporary de-escalation as cover for a broader institutional assault designed to neutralize her influence before she could establish deeper roots in the school community. "What kind of incidents?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The official version is that concerned parents have reported unprofessional conduct by a new faculty member, including inappropriate physical contact with community members and favoritism toward certain students, Patricia explained, her voice heavy with frustration. "They're being very careful not to make specific accusations that could be legally challenged, but the implication is clear." Sarah recognized the strategy immediately. Robert Thompson was conducting a character assassination campaign using innuendo and vague allegations that would be difficult to refute directly while gradually building a case for her removal. It was sophisticated psychological warfare that suggested either extensive experience or professional consultation with experts in reputation management. "How much support does he have on the school board?" Patricia's expression grew more troubled. Robert Thompson has contributed to the campaigns of 4 out of 7 board members over the past 6 years. His construction company has handled major renovation projects for the district, and his dealership provides fleet vehicles at discounted rates. Even board members who might personally disagree with his methods have practical reasons to avoid confronting him directly. The scope of the Thompson family's institutional capture was more extensive than Sarah had initially realized. Robert Thompson hadn't just bought influence. He had systematically embedded himself into the district's financial and political infrastructure in ways that made opposition extremely costly for anyone who depended on the system for their livelihood. What about Hayes? Where does he stand in all this? Robert hired Hayes 5 years ago after the previous principal was forced out for budgetary disagreements, Patricia explained. Hayes is competent at educational administration, but he's also smart enough to understand that his job security depends on maintaining good relationships with the families who actually control district resources. Sarah absorbed this information while conducting a strategic assessment of her current position. The Thompson family had used Jake's behavioral problems as a probe to identify her as a potential threat, then escalated through Derek's failed intimidation attempt, and was now implementing a systematic campaign to remove her through institutional pressure rather than direct confrontation. In military terms, they had transitioned from tactical skirmishes to strategic warfare, bringing superior resources and local intelligence to bear in an environment where Sarah's combat skills provided no advantage against bureaucratic and political maneuvering. "Patricia, I appreciate you keeping me informed about these developments. Has anyone suggested specific actions the administration might take?" The current proposal is a comprehensive review of all new faculty members to ensure they're meeting community standards and district expectations, Patricia said carefully. "It's presented as a quality assurance measure, but everyone understands that it's really about creating justification for removing teachers who don't fit the political climate." Sarah recognized this as a classic institutional purge, using procedural mechanisms to eliminate opponents while maintaining the appearance of legitimate administrative action. She had observed similar tactics in various international contexts where authoritarian forces used bureaucratic processes to neutralize threats without resorting to obviously illegal methods. The conversation was interrupted by rapid footsteps in the hallway. Emily Chun appeared around the corner, moving with the urgent energy of someone carrying important intelligence. Her usual careful composure was replaced by obvious agitation that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Miss Mitchell, Mrs. Wells, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but something's happening that you need to know about right away." Sarah gestured for Emily to continue, her tactical awareness shifting into high gear as she prepared for whatever crisis might be developing. "Ryan Walsh is in the parking lot with Derek Thompson and 2 other guys I don't recognize. They've Been there for about 20 minutes, and they keep looking toward the building like they're waiting for something. The information triggered immediate alarm responses in Sarah's threat assessment matrix. Ryan Walsh had become increasingly unstable following Jake's transformation, his aggressive tendencies no longer constrained by group discipline or clear objectives. His alliance with Derek Thompson suggested that the adult branch of the Thompson family was attempting to maintain pressure through alternative channels. "Emily, are there other students in the parking lot right now?" "A few, but most people have already left for the day. Maria noticed them first and asked me to find you because she thought the situation looked potentially dangerous." Sarah appreciated Maria's instincts and Emily's courage in delivering the warning, but the developing situation represented exactly the kind of escalation that could provide Robert Thompson with ammunition for his administrative campaign against her. If Ryan and Derek created a confrontation that resulted in police involvement or student injuries, the incident would be used to justify her removal, regardless of who initiated the conflict. "Thank you for the warning, Emily. I want you to go directly to the main office and stay there until this situation is resolved. Mrs. Wells, could you notify building security and ask them to monitor the parking lot situation?" Patricia nodded grimly, understanding the potential implications of whatever was developing outside. "Sarah, you should probably stay inside until we know more about their intentions. If Derek Thompson is involved, this could escalate beyond normal student discipline issues." Sarah appreciated Patricia's concern, but her military training had taught her that allowing hostile forces to choose the time and place of engagement was almost always a tactical mistake. Ryan Walsh and Derek Thompson were clearly planning something that required her presence or participation, and waiting passively for their next move would only give them additional time to prepare whatever trap they were setting. "I understand the risks, Patricia, but I can't allow students or staff to be threatened while I hide in the building. Let me handle this situation, and please make sure that appropriate authorities are notified if things escalate beyond what I can manage alone." Sarah made her way toward the exit, her mental state shifting into the combat mindset that had kept her alive during multiple deployments in hostile environments. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, mild-mannered English teacher. She was Lieutenant Mitchell, Navy SEAL, preparing to neutralize a threat to civilians under her protection. The October air was crisp and carried the scent of fallen leaves as Sarah stepped into the faculty parking lot. Ryan Walsh stood near a lifted pickup truck with Derek Thompson and two other men in their early 20s, all of them displaying the kind of aggressive posturing that suggested they were psychologically preparing for confrontation. Sarah recognized the tactical situation immediately. 4 adult males positioned to control her movement options, probably armed with at least improvised weapons, and operating in an environment where witnesses would be limited and response times for official help would be measured in minutes rather than seconds. Ryan noticed her approach first, his expression shifting from nervous anticipation to predatory satisfaction as he realized his target had appeared as expected. "Well, look who decided to show up," Ryan called out, his voice carrying the forced confidence of someone trying to convince himself he was in control of the situation. "We've been waiting to have a conversation with you, Miss Mitchell." Sarah continued walking toward them at a steady pace, her apparent calm masking the tactical calculations running through her mind. 4 opponents meant she would need to neutralize threats quickly and decisively, probably starting with Derek as the most physically capable before the others could coordinate their attacks. "Ryan, you're not supposed to be on school property after hours without administrative approval. I suggest you and your friends leave immediately before this becomes a disciplinary matter." Derek Thompson stepped forward, his earlier encounter with Sarah apparently having convinced him that verbal intimidation needed to be supplemented with superior numbers and environmental advantages. "This isn't about school discipline anymore," Derek said, his tone carrying the ugly confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "This is about respect and consequences for people who don't understand their place in this community." One of the unknown men moved to Sarah's left, attempting to flank her position, while Derek maintained her attention. Sarah recognized the coordination as evidence of planning and preparation, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous confrontation, but a deliberate ambush designed to achieve specific objectives. "Miss Mitchell," Ryan added, his voice taking on a mocking tone, "you seem to think you're some kind of tough girl who can handle any situation. But you're not in whatever fantasy world you came from anymore. This is real life, and real life has consequences for people who don't know when to back down." Sarah realized that Ryan Walsh had become the primary instigator of this confrontation, probably driven by frustration at his loss of status following Jake's transformation and encouraged by Derek's promises of adult support for retaliating against her. "Ryan, you're 18 years old and about to graduate from high school. This is exactly the kind of decision that will define whether you become a productive adult or spend your early 20s dealing with criminal charges and civil lawsuits." "Don't try to lecture me," Ryan snapped, his carefully constructed bravado beginning to crack under the pressure of actually implementing whatever plan they had developed. "You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." The fourth man completed his flanking movement, positioning himself to Sarah's right, while Derek and Ryan maintained visual contact from the front. Sarah was now surrounded, but her military training had prepared her for exactly this type of multiple opponent scenario in environments where backup was unavailable and failure meant capture or death. "Last chance to walk away from this mistake," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying a new tone of authority that caused all four men to hesitate momentarily. "The only mistake here was thinking you could come into our town and disrespect our family," Derek replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments earlier. Sarah's composure in the face of overwhelming odds was clearly not matching their expectations for how this confrontation would develop. "Show her what happens to teachers who think they're untouchable," Ryan said to Derek, his words intended to commit all of them to action before anyone could reconsider the wisdom of their plan. Derek reached towards Sarah's shoulder with the same grabbing motion that had failed so spectacularly during their previous encounter, apparently having learned nothing from his earlier experience with her capabilities. What happened next would later be described by security cameras and witnesses in ways that varied dramatically depending on their perspective and understanding of close-quarters combat techniques, but the essential facts were undisputable. Sarah intercepted Derek's reaching hand, used his forward momentum to throw him directly into the unknown man who had been flanking her left side, then pivoted to strike the second flanker with a precise blow that dropped him immediately. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds and left Ryan Walsh standing alone beside his truck, staring in shock at 3 grown men who were groaning on the asphalt. "Ryan," Sarah said conversationally, not even breathing hard from the brief physical encounter, "you now have a choice to make. You can help your friends get medical attention and leave school property immediately, or you can continue this confrontation and discover that I'm just getting started." Ryan's face had gone pale as he processed the reality that the quiet English teacher had just neutralized 3 adult men with techniques that suggested professional-level combat training. His carefully planned ambush had disintegrated in seconds, leaving him alone and facing someone whose capabilities were obviously far beyond anything he had imagined. "Who the hell are you?" Ryan whispered, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I'm someone who spent 6 years learning how to protect innocent people from predators who think they can use violence and intimidation to get their way," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had faced real enemies in life-and-death situations. "And right now, you get to decide whether you're going to continue being a predator or start learning how to be a decent human being." Derek Thompson was struggling to his feet, his previous confidence replaced by genuine fear as he realized that he had catastrophically underestimated the woman he had attempted to intimidate. "This isn't over," Derek said weakly, though his body language suggested he desperately wanted the confrontation to end before Sarah decided to demonstrate additional techniques. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied with absolute finality. "Because if any of you ever threaten me, my students, or any other member of this school community again, I will make sure that law enforcement, the district administration, and your families understand exactly what kind of people you really are." She gestured toward the security cameras that had recorded the entire encounter. "Those cameras captured everything that just happened, including your coordination of this ambush and your explicit threats. That evidence will be preserved, and any future harassment will be treated as part of an ongoing criminal conspiracy." Ryan looked around desperately, apparently hoping for rescue that wasn't coming. His friends were still recovering from their brief encounter with Sarah's combat skills, and the reality of their situation was becoming impossible to deny. "Get your friends medical attention if they need it, then leave immediately," Sarah continued. "And Ryan, use this experience to think seriously about what kind of man you want to become, because the path you're currently on leads nowhere good." As the four young men limped away from the parking lot, Sarah remained in position until they were completely gone before allowing herself to process what had just occurred. The Thompson family's escalation strategy had just provided her with documented evidence of coordinated harassment and assault, which would make Robert Thompson's administrative campaign significantly more difficult to sustain. But Sarah also understood that she had just crossed a line that would make continued operation under her current cover extremely challenging. The quiet English teacher persona was no longer sustainable now that multiple people had witnessed her neutralize four adult attackers with techniques that obviously came from military training. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw what happened in the parking lot. We need to talk. Meet me at the diner on Main Street in 1 hour if you want to understand what you're really dealing with. A friend, Sarah." Stared at the message, her tactical instincts immediately analyzing the potential threats and opportunities it represented. Someone had been watching the confrontation, possessed her personal phone number, and claimed to have information about the broader situation she was facing. In military intelligence, unsolicited contact from unknown sources was always treated as potentially hostile until proven otherwise. But Sarah's current circumstances suggested that she might need allies with knowledge of local power structures that she couldn't develop through normal channels. As she drove toward the meeting location, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation at Riverside High School had evolved since her first day as the mild-mannered new English teacher. The Thompson family's systematic escalation had forced her to reveal capabilities that would make her previous cover story impossible to maintain, which meant she was now operating in an environment where her true background was either known or strongly suspected by multiple parties. But she had also successfully neutralized the immediate physical threat posed by Derek Thompson and Ryan Walsh, while gathering evidence that could be used to protect other potential victims of their harassment campaign. The confrontation had been decisive enough that neither of them was likely to attempt direct physical intimidation again without significantly more preparation and resources. The question now was whether the mysterious contact represented another threat requiring neutralization or a potential ally who could help her understand the full scope of what she was facing in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The Cedar Falls Diner occupied a corner building on Main Street that had probably been serving coffee and comfort food since the 1950s, its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor creating the kind of timeless atmosphere that suggested countless conversations had taken place within its walls. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, her military training dictating that she scout the environment and identify potential threats before any meeting with unknown contacts. She chose a booth near the back exit with clear sight lines to both entrances, positioning herself so that she could observe approaching vehicles through the large front windows. The dinner crowd was typical for a Tuesday evening in a small Ohio town, families with young children, elderly couples sharing quiet meals, and a few solitary diners reading newspapers or checking their phones. At exactly the appointed time, a woman in her mid-40s entered the diner, scanning the interior with the purposeful gaze of someone looking for a specific person. She was professionally dressed in a way that suggested either business or law enforcement background. Her auburn hair pulled back in a practical style, and her movements carrying the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. The woman spotted Sarah immediately and approached her booth with measured steps, her expression serious but not hostile. As she drew closer, Sarah noticed details that triggered recognition patterns from her military experience. The way the woman's jacket was cut to conceal a sidearm, the tactical awareness in her visual scanning, and the controlled posture that suggested extensive training in personal protection. "Miss Mitchell," the woman said quietly as she slid into the booth across from Sarah. "My name is Detective Angela Martinez with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. I apologize for the dramatic approach, but the circumstances surrounding your situation require discretion that normal official channels can't provide." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern at this revelation. Detective Martinez represented official law enforcement, which meant potential support against the Thompson family's harassment campaign. But her presence also suggested that Sarah's activities had attracted attention from state-level authorities. "Detective Martinez, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not sure what circumstances you're referring to. I'm just a high school English teacher trying to do my job." Martinez smiled slightly, her expression conveying both understanding and skepticism. "Miss Mitchell, we both know that's not entirely accurate. Your performance in the parking lot this afternoon was captured not only by school security cameras, but also by surveillance equipment that the Bureau has been using to monitor certain activities in Cedar Falls." The revelation that state law enforcement had been conducting surveillance operations in Cedar Falls triggered immediate questions about the scope and nature of whatever investigation was underway. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor while rapidly processing the implications of this unexpected development. What kind of activities require Bureau surveillance in a small town like Cedar Falls? The kind that involves systematic corruption of public institutions, witness intimidation, and organized harassment campaigns designed to silence people who threaten established power structures. Martinez replied, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting facts rather than making accusations. She opened a slim folder that she had placed on the table, revealing photographs and documents that immediately captured Sarah's attention. The images showed Robert Thompson meeting with various individuals in locations that suggested careful planning to avoid normal oversight, while the documents appeared to be financial records and communication logs. The Thompson family has been under investigation for 18 months as part of a broader examination of municipal corruption in several Ohio communities, Martinez explained. What started as a routine audit of construction contracts has evolved into a complex case involving bid rigging, witness intimidation, and systematic abuse of public institutions. Sarah studied the photographs while maintaining her cover as a civilian teacher who would be shocked by such revelations. In reality, she was analyzing the evidence with the trained eye of someone who had conducted similar investigations in international contexts, where corruption and institutional capture were common tactics used by hostile actors. "Detective Martinez, this is all very concerning, but I'm not sure how it relates to my situation at Riverside High School. Miss Mitchell, the Bureau has been looking for someone with the skills and positioning to document the Thompson family's methods from inside the educational system. Your background and recent experiences make you uniquely qualified to assist with this investigation." Sarah felt a familiar chill of recognition. Detective Martinez wasn't just sharing information. She was recruiting Sarah as an asset in an ongoing law enforcement operation. In military terms, she was being asked to transition from accidental Target to active participant in intelligence gathering against the Thompson family. What kind of assistance are you referring to? Martinez leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private, despite the ambient noise of the diner. We need documented evidence of how the Thompson family uses their influence to corrupt disciplinary processes, intimidate faculty members, and create hostile environments for students who don't conform to their social hierarchy. And you think I'm in a position to gather that kind of evidence? Miss Mitchell, you've already demonstrated that you're not intimidated by their standard pressure tactics, and your professional background provides you with skills that most teachers don't possess. More importantly, they've already targeted you, which means you have legitimate reasons to document their activities for your own protection. Sarah recognized the logic of Martinez's argument, but she also understood the risks involved in transitioning from defensive operations to active intelligence gathering. Working with law enforcement would provide official support and legal protection, but it would also commit her to a level of engagement that could have serious personal and professional consequences. Detective, I appreciate your confidence in my abilities, but I need to understand what kind of commitment you're asking me to make. What would this assistance actually involve? Martinez reached into her folder and produced a small electronic device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a digital recording system that can capture audio and video evidence while appearing to be a normal educational tablet. We would provide you with training on its use and legal guidance on evidence collection procedures. The sophistication of the equipment suggested that the Bureau's investigation was well-funded and technically advanced, which indicated serious commitment to building a comprehensive case against the Thompson family. Sarah's military experience with intelligence operations provided her with enough background to recognize professional quality surveillance technology. What kind of legal protections would be available if my cooperation with this investigation became known? Full witness protection services if necessary, including relocation assistance and identity security, Martinez replied immediately. But we're hoping that won't be necessary. Our goal is to build a case strong enough that the Thompson family's influence networks collapse before they can retaliate against individual witnesses. Sarah considered the offer while observing Martinez's body language for signs of deception or hidden agendas. The detective appeared genuinely committed to the investigation and personally invested in stopping the Thompson family's abuse of power. But Sarah's military experience had taught her to remain skeptical of official promises until they were tested under pressure. Detective Martinez, before I make any decisions about cooperation, I need to understand something. How long have you known about my actual background? Martinez paused, clearly weighing how much information to reveal. The Bureau ran standard background checks on all new faculty members at Riverside High School as part of our investigation. Your military service record raised some questions about why someone with your qualifications would choose to teach in a small Ohio town. But we didn't make any direct connections until we observed your performance against Derek Thompson and his associates. So you've been watching me since I arrived in Cedar Falls? Watching might be too strong a word. We've been aware of your presence and monitoring your interactions with the Thompson family, but we weren't actively investigating you until it became clear that you were effectively resisting their intimidation tactics. Sarah appreciated Martinez's honesty about the surveillance, but the revelation also highlighted how her cover story had been compromised from the beginning. The Bureau's investigation had created an environment where her background and activities were subject to official scrutiny regardless of her personal preferences. What happens if I decline to cooperate with this investigation? Nothing negative from our perspective, Martinez assured her. You would continue teaching at Riverside High School, and we would continue our investigation through other means. But Miss Mitchell, you should understand that the Thompson family isn't going to stop their harassment campaign just because you've successfully resisted their initial attempts at intimidation. The detective's warning aligned with Sarah's own tactical assessment. The Thompson family had invested too much in their power structure to allow a single teacher to demonstrate that their influence could be successfully challenged. They would continue escalating until either she was removed from the equation or they suffered consequences severe enough to deter future aggression. What kind of timeline are we talking about for this investigation? We expect to have sufficient evidence for indictments within 6 months, assuming we can document the specific instances of corruption and intimidation that we know are occurring, but haven't been able to prove in court. Sarah understood that 6 months of active intelligence gathering would require sustained performance under extreme pressure, with the constant risk of discovery by subjects who had already demonstrated willingness to use violence and intimidation against perceived threats. But it would also provide an opportunity to protect vulnerable students like Emily Chun while gathering evidence that could permanently neutralize the Thompson family's ability to abuse their power. Detective Martinez, if I agree to cooperate with this investigation, what kind of operational support would be available? I'm thinking specifically about situations where the subjects might escalate beyond harassment to actual violence. Full tactical support, including emergency response teams and real-time monitoring of your safety, Martinez replied. We understand that you're capable of handling most situations independently, but we're not asking you to operate without backup against subjects who have already demonstrated criminal intent. The promise of tactical support addressed Sarah's primary concern about accepting the assignment. Working alone against organized opponents was always dangerous, but operating with official backing and emergency response capabilities would provide significant advantages over her current isolated position. I need 24 hours to consider this proposal, Sarah said finally. This is a significant commitment that could affect my long-term career and personal safety. Of course, Martinez agreed, sliding a business card across the table. My contact information is on there, along with a secure number you can use to reach me at any time. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that the Bureau has tremendous respect for your service record and your commitment to protecting students at Riverside High School. After Martinez left the diner, Sarah remained in her booth for several more minutes, processing the implications of the conversation while observing the evening activities of Cedar Falls through the large front windows. The quiet small-town atmosphere concealed a level of corruption and institutional abuse that required state-level law enforcement intervention, which suggested that the Thompson family's influence was more extensive and dangerous than she had initially realized. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Thompson. Miss Mitchell, I heard about what happened in the parking lot today. I'm sorry my brother and Ryan involved you in their stupidity. Can we talk tomorrow? I think there are things you should know about my family that might help you understand what you're dealing with. Sarah stared at the message, recognizing it as either a genuine offer of assistance from Jake or a sophisticated attempt to gather intelligence about her capabilities and intentions. Either way, it represented another potential source of information about the Thompson family's operations and decision-making processes. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had evolved since her first day at Riverside High School. What had begun as a simple career transition from military service to civilian education had become a complex intelligence operation involving state-level law enforcement, organized corruption, and personal risks that extended far beyond normal teaching responsibilities. But she had also discovered that her military training and experience provided her with unique capabilities for protecting vulnerable students and challenging institutional abuse in ways that most civilians couldn't attempt. The Thompson family's harassment campaign had inadvertently revealed both the scope of the problem and Sarah's potential role in addressing it through official channels. The question now was whether she was prepared to commit to 6 months of dangerous undercover work in service of a cause that aligned with her personal values. but could permanently alter her civilian life. The decision would determine not only her own future, but also the safety and well-being of students like Emily Chun, who depended on adults with the courage and capability to stand up to institutional bullies. Sarah Mitchell had spent her adult life in service to causes larger than herself, and the situation in Cedar Falls represented exactly the kind of mission that had originally motivated her to seek military service. The Thompson family's abuse of power was a threat to the community's most vulnerable members, and she possessed the skills and positioning to address that threat through official channels that could provide lasting protection rather than temporary deterrence. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah had made her decision. Tomorrow she would contact Detective Martinez and accept the assignment, beginning a new phase of her mission to protect the students and faculty of Riverside High School from predators who believed their wealth and influence placed them above the law. The November morning that would forever change the power dynamics at Riverside High School began with an emergency faculty meeting called by Principal Hayes at 7:30. In the morning, Sarah arrived to find her colleagues gathered in the conference room with expressions ranging from confusion to outright concern, their usual pre-class energy replaced by an atmosphere of nervous tension. Hayes stood at the front of the room, with Robert Thompson beside him, the older man's presence immediately explaining the source of everyone's unease. Robert Thompson commanded attention through sheer force of personality and economic influence, his expensive suit and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone delivering bad news while trying to maintain morale. "Mr. Thompson has graciously volunteered to share some concerns that have been brought to his attention regarding our schools, educational environment, and community relationships." Sarah felt Detective Martinez's recording device in her jacket pocket, the small weight serving as a reminder of her dual role as teacher and intelligence asset. She had been gathering evidence for 3 weeks now, documenting the subtle ways that Thompson family influence corrupted normal disciplinary and academic processes. Robert Thompson stepped forward with the practiced ease of someone who had addressed countless meetings where his opinion carried the weight of economic necessity. His eyes swept the assembled faculty with calculating assessment, pausing briefly on Sarah before moving on without obvious recognition. "I want to thank Principal Hayes for allowing me to address these important issues directly with the people who shape our children's daily educational experience," Robert began, his tone carrying the false warmth that politicians and businessmen used when delivering ultimatums disguised as requests for cooperation. "Over the past several weeks, I've received concerning reports about certain faculty members who seem to be struggling with the transition to our community's educational philosophy and values. These individuals appear to be having difficulty understanding that effective teaching requires collaboration with families rather than confrontation." Sarah recognized the carefully crafted language as a direct attack on her methods, though. Robert was being strategic enough to avoid specific accusations that could be legally challenged. She activated the recording device through a subtle gesture that appeared to be adjusting her jacket, beginning documentation of what promised to be an important piece of evidence. "Now I want to be clear that we appreciate diversity of thought and teaching approaches," Robert continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that wealthy people often used when explaining reality to those they considered intellectually inferior. "But there's a difference between innovative education and disruptive behavior that undermines the collaborative relationship between families and schools." Mrs. Wells shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her expression suggesting that she understood exactly who was being targeted by Robert's deliberately vague accusations. Several other faculty members exchanged glances that conveyed similar recognition, though none appeared willing to challenge Thompson directly in this forum. "Specifically, we've had reports of inappropriate physical contact between faculty members and community members, favoritism toward certain students based on personal preferences rather than academic merit, and attempts to undermine established disciplinary procedures through unauthorized interventions. The accusations were sophisticated enough to sound plausible to anyone who didn't understand the actual circumstances, while being vague enough to make direct refutation difficult. Sarah realized that Robert Thompson had been carefully crafting this attack for weeks, probably with professional assistance from consultants who specialized in character assassination through institutional channels. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said calmly, her voice cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the conference room, "could you be more specific about these allegations? As faculty members, we deserve to understand exactly what behaviors are being characterized as problematic so we can address any legitimate concerns." Robert's eyes locked onto Sarah's with the focused intensity of a predator who had been waiting for his target to reveal herself. His expression shifted from false benevolence to barely concealed hostility as he realized that she wasn't going to remain silent while being attacked through innuendo and implication. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your interest in clarification," Robert replied, his tone now carrying an edge that suggested barely controlled anger. "Perhaps you could help us understand why a new faculty member would feel it necessary to engage in physical confrontations with community members rather than addressing concerns through appropriate administrative channels." Sarah felt the familiar surge of controlled fury that came when enemies revealed their true nature through direct attack. Robert Thompson had just abandoned subtlety in favor of explicit accusation, which meant he was confident enough in his institutional protection to risk open confrontation with someone whose capabilities he clearly didn't fully understand. "Mr. Thompson, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of recent incidents. If community members have concerns about my professional conduct, I'm certainly willing to address them through proper procedures that ensure fairness and accuracy." "Fair procedures," Robert repeated with a harsh laugh that conveyed contempt for the concept. "Miss Mitchell, fairness requires understanding that this community has certain expectations about how problems are resolved. And those expectations don't include outsiders who think they can impose their own values on families who have lived here for generations." The mask was now completely off. Robert Thompson was openly asserting that his family's wealth and local influence entitled them to operate outside normal rules of professional conduct and legal accountability. Sarah understood that this moment represented the breaking point where subtlety and diplomacy would give way to direct confrontation. "Mr. Thompson, every member of this school community deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their family's economic status or political connections. That includes students who might not have the social advantages that protect others from bullying and harassment." Robert's face darkened with genuine anger as Sarah's words struck directly at the heart of his family's power structure. The other faculty members watched in fascination and horror as the quiet New English teacher openly challenged the most influential man in Cedar Falls, without showing any signs of intimidation or deference. "Young lady, you seem to have a serious misunderstanding about your position in this community," Robert said, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone that he probably used when threatening business competitors or political opponents. "This isn't whatever liberal fantasy world you came from. This is Cedar Falls, Ohio, and things work differently here." Principal Hayes attempted to intervene with obvious desperation. "Perhaps we should schedule individual meetings to address specific concerns, rather than continuing this discussion in a general faculty forum." "No," Robert replied firmly, his attention remaining focused on Sarah with laser-like intensity. "I think it's important for everyone to understand exactly what happens when people refuse to respect the collaborative relationships that keep this community functioning effectively." Sarah recognized the threat for what it was. Robert Thompson was about to demonstrate his power by humiliating her in front of her colleagues, probably expecting her to capitulate under pressure rather than risk further escalation. What he didn't understand was that she had been documenting his family's criminal activities for 3 weeks and was prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation. "Mr. Thompson, I understand that your family has significant influence in this community, but that influence doesn't extend to dictating how faculty members perform their professional responsibilities or treat students who need protection from harassment." The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air like a declaration of war. She had just explicitly challenged Robert Thompson's authority in front of witnesses, using language that left no room for misinterpretation about her willingness to continue opposing his family's abuse of power. Robert Thompson's expression transformed from anger to cold calculation as he realized that Sarah Mitchell was not going to be intimidated by conventional pressure tactics. His next words were delivered with the precision of someone who had spent decades using institutional leverage to destroy opponents who threatened his interests. "Miss Mitchell, I think this conversation has revealed some fundamental incompatibilities between your approach to education and this community's values. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you considered seeking opportunities elsewhere that might be more aligned with your particular philosophy." "Are you suggesting that I resign?" Sarah asked, her voice maintaining perfect calm, while internally she prepared for whatever escalation might follow. "I'm suggesting that people who can't work collaboratively with community stakeholders often find themselves unhappy and unsuccessful in positions that require such collaboration," Robert replied with the smooth delivery of someone who had made similar threats countless times before. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement drawing the attention of everyone in the room as they sensed that something significant was about to happen. Her military training had taught her to recognize the moment when diplomatic solutions became impossible and direct action became necessary. "Mr. Thompson, I want to make something very clear to you and everyone else in this room," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new tone of authority that caused several faculty members to sit up straighter in their chairs. "I came to Riverside High School to teach literature and help students develop critical thinking skills. I didn't come here to participate in some feudal system where wealthy families get to dictate educational policy through intimidation and threats." Robert's eyes narrowed as he realized that Sarah was not only refusing to back down, but was actively escalating the confrontation in ways that he hadn't anticipated. His usual tactics of economic pressure and social isolation weren't working against someone who appeared immune to conventional forms of community coercion. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she transitioned into full combat mode, "I want everyone to understand that harassment of students, intimidation of faculty members, and corruption of educational institutions are not community values that deserve respect. They're criminal behaviors that deserve prosecution." The accusation of criminal activity caused several faculty members to gasp audibly, while Principal Hayes looked like he wanted to disappear through the conference room floor. Robert Thompson's face went through a series of color changes as he processed the implications of being accused of criminal conduct in front of multiple witnesses. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Robert said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "And you have no idea what kind of consequences you're inviting by making that kind of accusation against my family." "Actually, Mr. Thompson, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah replied with the calm confidence of someone who possessed documentary evidence of the crime she was alleging. "And I'm not intimidated by threats from people who think their money makes them untouchable." Robert Thompson's self-control finally snapped completely. In a move that demonstrated either complete loss of judgment or absolute confidence in his impunity, he lunged forward and grabbed the front of Sarah's blouse with both hands, clearly intending to physically intimidate her through aggressive contact. "You listen to me very carefully," Robert snarled, his face inches from Sarah's as he tightened his grip on her clothing. "Nobody talks to me that way in my town, especially not some nobody teacher who doesn't understand how things work around here." What happened next was captured in perfect detail by the recording device in Sarah's jacket and would later become crucial evidence in multiple criminal prosecutions. Robert Thompson's aggressive grab had caused Sarah's blouse to tear at the shoulder, exposing part of her Navy SEAL tattoo that she had kept carefully hidden beneath professional clothing. The partial visibility of military insignia on Sarah's shoulder caused Robert's expression to shift from rage to confusion as he began to suspect that he might have seriously misjudged who he was dealing with. But his grip on her torn blouse prevented him from backing away gracefully, leaving him committed to a physical confrontation with someone whose actual capabilities he was only beginning to understand. Sarah's response was measured and precise, designed to neutralize the immediate threat while providing maximum evidentiary value for the recording device that was capturing every moment of the encounter. She applied a joint manipulation technique that caused Robert to release her blouse immediately while simultaneously positioning him in a way that prevented further aggressive action. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said calmly, maintaining control of his wrist while speaking in the same professional tone she might use to discuss homework assignments. "You just committed assault and battery against a faculty member in front of multiple witnesses. You also damaged my personal property and created a hostile work environment through explicit threats and intimidation." Robert Thompson found himself in the unprecedented position of being physically controlled by someone he had assumed was helpless against his superior social position and economic influence. The realization that Sarah possessed professional-level combat skills was obviously causing him to reassess everything he thought he knew about their confrontation. "Moreover," Sarah continued, her voice gaining an edge that suggested she was just getting started, "your behavior today has demonstrated exactly the kind of criminal mindset that has allowed your family to corrupt educational institutions and terrorize vulnerable students for years." She released Robert's wrist and stepped back, leaving him standing in front of the assembled faculty with his shirt disheveled and his authority completely shattered by the demonstration that physical intimidation was not an effective tactic against someone with Sarah's background and training. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah addressed the room while Robert struggled to regain his composure, "what you've just witnessed is how the Thompson family maintains control over this school district. They use threats, intimidation, and when necessary, physical assault to silence anyone who challenges their abuse of power." The faculty members stared in stunned silence as Sarah continued her exposition, her torn blouse revealing enough of her military tattoo to suggest that the quiet English teacher possessed a background that explained her immunity to conventional forms of intimidation. "This ends today," Sarah declared with absolute finality. "No more students will be harassed for failing to show proper deference to the Thompson family. No more faculty members will be threatened for treating all students with equal respect. And no more administrative decisions will be made based on economic pressure rather than educational merit." Robert Thompson finally found his voice, though it lacked the commanding authority he had displayed at the beginning of the meeting. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said weakly. "This community will never accept what you're trying to impose on us. Mr. Thompson, this community is about to learn that wealth and political connections don't provide immunity from criminal prosecution." Sarah replied, "Your family's reign of terror over Riverside High School is finished." Principal Hayes attempted to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. "Perhaps we should adjourn this meeting and schedule individual conferences to address these concerns through appropriate administrative channels." "Actually," Sarah said, reaching into her jacket to produce the recording device that had captured everything that had just occurred, "I think law enforcement should be the appropriate channel for addressing criminal assault and institutional corruption." The sight of the recording device caused Robert Thompson's face to go completely pale as he realized that his loss of control had been documented in detail, sufficient to support serious criminal charges. His attempt to intimidate Sarah through physical aggression had instead provided her with irrefutable evidence of exactly the kind of behavior that state investigators needed to build their case. "You've been recording this meeting?" Robert asked, his voice cracking with the stress of understanding how completely his intimidation strategy had backfired. "Mr. Thompson, documenting threats and harassment is a reasonable precaution for someone whose safety has been threatened by your family multiple times," Sarah replied. "This recording will be turned over to appropriate authorities, along with other evidence of your family's criminal activities." The revelation that Sarah possessed additional evidence beyond the current incident caused Robert to stumble backward as he began to comprehend the full scope of the legal jeopardy he had created for himself and his family through years of unchecked abuse of power. "This isn't over," Robert said desperately, though his voice carried none of the confidence that had characterized his earlier threats. "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed. "It's not over. It's just beginning. But from this point forward, your family will be dealing with law enforcement officers and federal prosecutors rather than intimidated teachers and frightened students." As Robert Thompson fled the conference room in complete defeat, Sarah turned to address her colleagues who were still processing what they had witnessed. The quiet English teacher had just single-handedly destroyed the power structure that had controlled their professional lives for years, using a combination of moral courage and physical capability that none of them had suspected she possessed. "Mrs. Wells," Sarah said to her mentor, whose expression suggested she was still trying to reconcile the mild-mannered new teacher with the woman who had just neutralized the most powerful man in Cedar Falls, "I think we should notify the superintendent that today's faculty meeting documented some serious policy violations that require immediate administrative attention." Over the following weeks, the evidence that Sarah had gathered during her cooperation with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation would result in federal indictments for corruption, witness intimidation, and civil rights violations that would send Robert Thompson and several associates to federal prison for significant sentences. Jake Thompson would transfer to a private school in Columbus, where he would spend his senior year learning leadership skills that didn't depend on his family's wealth and influence. His transformation from institutional bully to genuine student leader would become a model for other young people struggling to define themselves outside of toxic family dynamics. Derek Thompson and Ryan Walsh would face assault charges related to their parking lot ambush, receiving sentences that included community service at organizations serving victims of bullying and harassment. The experience would force both of them to confront the consequences of their actions in ways that their previous privilege had never required. Emily Chun would thrive in the new environment at Riverside High School, eventually earning a full scholarship to Ohio State University, where she would study education and return to Cedar Falls as a teacher committed to ensuring that no future students would face the kind of intimidation that had once characterized her daily experience. Detective Martinez would receive commendations for her investigation that exposed systematic corruption across multiple Ohio communities, leading to reforms and oversight procedures that would prevent similar abuse in the future. And Sarah Mitchell would continue teaching literature at Riverside High School, her true background now known to students and colleagues, who understood that sometimes the most effective teachers were those who had faced real-world challenges that gave them perspective on the importance of courage, integrity, and standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. The torn blouse that had revealed her military service would be preserved as evidence in the federal case, but more importantly, it had marked the moment when institutional bullying met someone whose training and character made them immune to intimidation and committed to justice regardless of personal cost. The transformation of Riverside High School from a place where wealth and influence determined treatment to an institution where every student could learn in safety and dignity would stand as testament to what could be accomplished when trained professionals chose to use their capabilities in service of protecting those who needed it most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.